read that right. I'm going to be whistling through 31 iconic movies that helped carve out the history of horror. It was both easy and tough to come up with a complete list, as this is technically not a top 31 horror movies of all time video, but rather a list of ones that I felt really helped define the genre in some fashion. Some of the movies you might argue should be on a garbage list, and I might agree with you, but their standing in horror, at least for today, necessitates them being here. So let's get to it in order of release. 1920, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. If they could put a camera in your brain and record a nightmare, this is probably what it would look like. A carnival hypnotist and his brainwashed sideshow freak, Caesar, who kills on command. The plot set against the backdrop of a distortion field of leaning architecture, elongated shadows, and twisted landscapes, all guaranteed to ensure a dizzying experience. 1922, Nosferatu. Another German expressionist film featuring a loosely based retelling of the story of Dracula, which they could not get the rights for, but went ahead anyways, much to the disgust of the Stoker family. The film was very nearly lost when a judge ordered all the reels destroyed, but copies surfaced later and solidified the film as a landmark project that elevated Count Orlok to one of the creepiest looking fuckers in all of horror. 1925, The Phantom of the Opera. Starring the undisputed star of silent horror cinema, Lon Chaney, as the deformed castaway who vanishes into the Paris catacombs after suffering a life of exploitation as a sideshow freak. He lurks the Paris Opera House and falls in love with a beautiful performer who he wants to help build into a star. If there is ever a man who was custom-made for that role in the silent film era, it's Lon Chaney. 1931, Dracula. The first big studio, big budget adaptation of the Stoker novel. The movie established the character as a cultural icon and stereotyped Bela Lugosi for the rest of his life in what I'm sure is the first true example of that happening. The movie was released with virtually no film score, which only served to enhance the terrifying atmosphere it was looking for, and Lugosi delivers a performance that haunted not only the viewers, but evidently himself until the day he died. Also released in 1931, Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff as the monster, and in doing so, along with Lugosi's Dracula, created perhaps the biggest 1-2 punch in horror history, as these two guys battled for horror supremacy for much of the 1930s. Frankenstein remains as one of the most influential movies, horror or otherwise, in all of cinema, as the monster has found its way into our homes at virtually every turn. Whether it was the classic horror movie, its endless sequels and reboots, comedy with the Munsters, Halloween costumes, and breakfast cereals. He's everywhere, and rightfully so. 1933. Before there was Jurassic Park, before there were creatures crawling out of the ocean or flying through the air in the 50s, there was King fucking Kong. This movie is hailed as one of the greatest achievements of its time in the history of movies. The groundbreaking visual effects to bring this giant ape to life was nothing short of miraculous for an art form that, even though it had been around for 40-some-odd years, was still very much in its infancy, and every creature feature that came out afterwards owes Marion C. Cooper a nod and a tip of the hat. 1941, The Wolfman, along with previously released Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy, completes what many consider to be the classic lineup of monsters that have stamped itself on pop culture and remains to this day. The Wolfman was played by Lon Chaney Jr., son of the Phantom, and he followed in his father's footsteps into the world of horror, becoming a legend in his own right, though some would argue not to the legendary status of his father, who was a true pioneer. 1953, and if you were a teenage George Romero, you'd be front row and center at the local theater for the Saturday matinee because chances are you'd be stuffing your face with popcorn while watching The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. A dinosaur frozen in the depths of the earth for millions of years and awakened and released accidentally after a nuclear bomb test, after which the rampage ensues. I had to admit I wasn't sure of the empirical length of a fathom, but after a quick Google search, I found that 1 fathom equals 6 feet, making me 1 fathom tall, which I'll consider a conceptual link to the creature. 1954, and still headlong in the world of creature features and 3D technology, Universal brings us yet another monster, the bizarre amphibious humanoid known as the creature from the Black Lagoon, or Gillman to his friends. He's in love with a beautiful woman and will stop at nothing to have her, in a theme commonly dubbed as a Beauty and the Beast type story. The underwater scenes are amazing, and this movie is a must-watch. 1958, The Blob. There is nothing more science fiction-y and horror-esque as a giant rubbery jello-like substance from outer space roaming your town and greedily absorbing all beings that lay in its path. And the only way to stop it? Send it for a long vacation to the Arctic Circle, which is when Steve McQueen adds his hopeful, yet somehow doubtful final line of the movie. Yeah, as long as the Arctic stays cold. Will the blob eventually be freed to sponge off the Earth again? You'll have to ask JR. 1960 brings us Psycho. On its face, this movie could have flopped had anyone else been involved. A woman on the run with stolen money, checks into a dusty old motel and is subsequently knifed to death in the shower by the front desk clerk. Interesting, but not exactly noteworthy as murder mystery movies had been around for a while. But you add Alfred Hitchcock as director, John Russell as cinematographer, Bernard Herrmann composing the score with its weet, 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 Janet Leigh as our felon on the run, and most importantly, Anthony freaking Perkins as Norman Bates, the strange motel owner with the mommy issues. And you have a movie worthy of taking home all the Oscars it was nominated for, but never won. 1963, The Raven, part of the Corman Poe movie cycle. This movie bridges a gap of sorts as we have an aging Boris Karloff in the final years of his career and life, and Jack Nicholson, a young unknown actor still trying to find his niche in the industry. Vincent Price, a constant in all but one of the Corman Poe movies, is a brilliant theatrical actor who always had this amazing knack for being terrifying and loosely jocular at the same time with his performances. Something of a rarity, and Corman knew exactly how to utilize these talents. 1964, shifting gears and going off mainstream grid a little, we have 2000 Maniacs, an early exploitation horror movie that, given the conservative values of the early 1960s, would have been stamped as an X rating had the code existed at the time, and something only worthy of viewing by not only adults, but adults with some very disturbing ideas of entertainment. The movie holds up after 60 years as many of the scenes are just as jarring today as they were then, and that's saying something, given we have movies like Grotesque and a Serbian film dripping down our TV screens. 1968, and that teenage George Romero has taken the lessons he got in those Saturday matinees in the 50s and put them to good use in Night of the Living Dead. Yes, zombie movies existed before this, and some of them were pretty good, but Romero's take on the subgenre was seminal, and pretty much all zombie movies to this day have cut branches from the roots planted by Romero. Drive-in theaters are becoming rarer as the years go on, but if you find one, chances are it's playing this movie. 1973, The Exorcist. A 12-year-old girl is possessed by the demon Pazuzu and turns her into a head-turning, foul-mouthed little creep, and it's up to Father Karras and Father Marin to perform the ancient ritual to rid her host body of the nagging archfiend. This movie had them fainting in the aisles, puking in their seats, and farting in their beds afterwards, as they were sure the demon was coming for them as soon as their eyes were closed. The first true horror movie to be nominated for Best Picture, and the first movie to have more medical distresses than a Grateful Dead concert. Give it a watch. 1974, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Indie movies were becoming more common as the 70s wore on, and this one, even with a simple title change or a few different casting decisions, could have ended up as a third billing on a triple feature at a drive-in for one summer. But it had the right cast, the right title, the right story, and the right chainsaw-wielding killer who became, without question, one of the most terrifying in all of horror, and elevated this movie to more than just simple cult status. It should be preserved in the National Film Registry for being culturally and aesthetically significant. 1978, and the second and even more brilliant zombie movie from George Romero, The Dawn of the Dead. This movie is perhaps one of the most rewatchable horror movies I've ever run across. The core cast is kept to just 4 people for much of the movie while they navigate both survival and the beast that is the mindless consumer consumption machine. Relative newcomer Tom Savini delivers on all fronts, with horror effects guaranteed to turn your shit into mustard. Continuing later on in 1978, it's the birth of the first real slasher icon. Before Jason and Freddy, there was the Shadow himself, Michael Myers in John Carpenter's Halloween. This movie was the catalyst for future slasher movies where the killer can be shot, stabbed, axed, poked, prodded, pickled, and peeled, but always manages to buck the odds by making it back for the next installment. 1979 and the Amityville Horror. I love the story, the folklore, the house, and the never-ending cult status of the whole thing. I just absolutely loathe this particular adaptation. I've touched on the reasons why in other videos, and I've always intended on doing a full expose to shart all over it like the dirty undies that it is. But here we are, and it has its place in history, and I certainly wouldn't want to deter people from seeing it. So see it for yourself, because chances are you'll be a little more generous in your appraisal of it than I ever was. 1980, Friday the 13th, and the start of the decade most closely associated with the slasher genre. You couldn't swing a dead cat in a video store without hitting a Friday the 13th sequel or one of its seemingly never-ending rip-off movies. This movie, though riding on the coattails a little of Halloween, was the granddaddy of the summer slashers, and Pamela Voorhees and her son Jason will always remain perched at the top of Butcher Mountain, never to be knocked off. Later in the same year, we have The Shining, starring the aforementioned unknown actor Jack Nicholson. He's had too many signature roles that could define his career, and the amount of times he's been nominated for Best Actor proves he was no slouch. But for horror fans, his performance in The Shining, while considered by some to be a little off the rails and overcooked, was perfect and spot on for this movie. In my opinion, it would have never worked had he not. It would have been a long, boring story of a wife who snorts, a kid who talks to his finger, and an introverted dad who's trying to write his first novel, while all snowbound for the winter in a fancy hotel. That's exciting. Moving into 1981, we have An American Werewolf in London, which in my never-to-be-questioned opinion, is best in class when it comes to werewolf movies. It has a perfect blend of drama, humor, suspense, gore, all rounded out by the much-expected coitus in the shower session. The transformation scene, though possibly bested years later in shows like Hemlock Grove and Being Human, is still a landmark in special effects and will always be my personal favorite. A few months later in 1981, we have one of those rare treats that nobody saw coming, and I'm talking about The Evil Dead. This movie is exploitation through and through, and had it been released even 10 years earlier, it would have been branded an offense to the public, put in a crate, and dropped into the ocean. Bruce Campbell made this movie with his portrayal of the hapless lone survivor who had to watch his friends and girlfriend all fall victim to the Kandarian demons who came calling for them after being resurrected. This movie is considered by many to be the quintessential horror movie. 1982 Poltergeist. This movie legit made me freak when I was a kid. I think I was 15 or so when it came out, and because of its PG rating, I went with my friends to see it, and my parents didn't have to be there in case I had a shit attack. It's a straightforward movie about a family whose house was unknowingly built on a graveyard and disturbs the dearly departed from going toward the light. The devil himself catches wind of this and arrives and sucks the young daughter through a portal into the afterlife to use as a decoy light to divert the good souls into hell. Do not miss this one. Later on in 1982, we got Creepshow. This is what happens when three of the top names in horror joined forces to create a homage to the very comics that scared them as kids in the 50s. Again, we have George Romero, Stephen King, and Tom Savini all putting in 100% to deliver 5 tales of terror and excitement, with the movie poster itself stating that it's the most fun you'll ever have being scared. 1984 and well into the onslaught of the slasher era, A Nightmare on Elm Street does something different than most in the genre. Its finger knife-wielding killer is not the usual silent stalker who only shows up when virgins are having sex. This guy actually doesn't shut up. He stalks and catcalls you in your dreams. His catchphrases have become legendary. And for much of the decade, we were waiting for either a new Jason movie or a new Freddy movie, with die-hard fans both arguing over which one was better. 1987 brings us The Lost Boys and a fresh take on vampires. Up to now, they had mostly been typecast as lone figures living in castles somewhere in Eastern Europe. Salem's Lot was a good departure from that trope. The Lost Boys was probably the first real movie that dealt with it from the teenager standpoint. It was a huge movie that influenced later teenage vampire productions like Buffy and Twilight. We're up to 1990. We've come a long way in the 70 years since Dr. Caligari haunted our dreams. But we survived all of that, and just in time to see Arachnophobia, which makes the list because it proves you don't need a giant house-sized spider to be terrifying. You just need a house full of little crawly ones to accomplish it. It also makes the list because Jeff Daniels is awesome, and lastly, to prove I can overcome my fear of the little bastards. At least enough to watch them on a movie screen. 1992, and I'm pulling another sequel out of the hamper to include on this list. Army of Darkness. Bruce Campbell had honed his acting skills in the days since The Evil Dead, and he famously elevates his Ash character to cult-level status, making him one of the undisputed Scream kings, and this movie to an instant classic. 1996 returns us to the slasher genre with Scream. After nearly a decade of duds, dull knives, and pointless sequels, legendary horror icon Wes Craven effectively rebrands slasher horrors by using not only all of the popular cliches, but openly mocking them within the context of the movie. Have to admit it's not one of my favorites, but it does deserve respect for anchoring a new generation of slasher movies for the kids to watch. Lastly, it's 1999, and our final movie on the list is none other than The Blair Witch Project. Found footage was not new, but it had never really been explored too much in mainstream movies. Blair Witch really kickstarted that trend to what it is today, and even though its popularity has waned in recent years, talented filmmakers can still strive to put their own twist on this particular subgenre. But I always loved Blair Witch. It seemed like it really went to great lengths to make people think this was real footage we were watching, with marketing ploys that probably wouldn't fool the public too much today. But it worked for them, and for that, this movie cemented its place in history as an instant classic. So, there we go. This was not really meant to be a top 31 list, as I love a lot of other horror movies more than some of these, but rather to just showcase were movies that acted as viable stepping stones, movies that influenced other filmmakers to take up the challenge, and movies that make us believe that monsters will be with us for some time to come.